So things like prayer. Now, largely the language of spiritual discipline comes from medieval Catholicism. And so if you talk about spiritual discipline with somebody, they might immediately say, oh, it's Catholic. You're trying to bring some Catholic into this. Well, sometimes I think us Protestants, members of the Churches of Christ or whatever other religious group, sometimes you can learn some things from Catholics. Now, that doesn't mean you just take anything from anybody and wholesale adopt it, but the idea that we should discipline ourselves to prayer. Now, if that means that you personally have to set a schedule where you set an alarm on your phone or your watch or whatever, and I'm going to pray at certain times. One of the things that's the case over in the humanities department. Now, I'm not saying this is something everybody has to adopt, but it's along those kind of lines. When the bell tolls for the hour, they have a clock in it, and when the bell tolls for the hour, they stop. Now, it's not necessarily prayer, it's more to take a moment of reflection. But sometimes there is a need for us to make those set times. Right? And now it might just be something like, first thing I do when I get out of bed is I'm going to pray. But it might be something as like I'm going to set, my alarm, or there's apps, right, that will alarm at certain times and remind you of things to pray. And you put in a prayer list and it randomly pulls something out, and so the alarm goes off and it's pray for my best friend. So I pray for my best friend. A couple hours ago it was off. Again, it says pray for your parents. Right? So I pray for my parents. So sometimes it might need to be that regimented, but if you don't have any sort of discipline aspect in your life, prayer is going to fall by the wayside. And so making sure to take time to pray. Reading. Reading the Bible. Now, as a Bible major or as a vocational Christian ministry major, there are various ways you're going to read the Bible over the next several years. You're going to read it in the context of the textual class. Right? I'm taking 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and so I'm reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians because that's what I'm taking. Reading the Bible because you're doing a passage for a paper, right? Reading the Bible for any variety of other reasons. Some of it's going to be, a lot of it is going to be academically oriented in this program. But you also need to take time to, do devotional reading. Reading just to read, to let the Word speak to you, instead of saying, I need to read these chapters for this test tomorrow. Or I need to read these chapters so I can prepare this sermon, or I can prepare this lesson, or this devotion. But doing that study that is focused on that. One type of reading, and I thought I had put this on the slide, but I didn't. One type of reading that is an interesting approach, that is this kind of informal type of reading, is what's known as the Lectio Divina. The Lectio Divina is a way of reading and meditating on the text from the Middle Ages, which involves reading the text multiple times. And so slowly, carefully reading the text instead of, there's certainly a place for reading plans, right? And so I'm trying to get through the Bible in an entire year, read through the Bible in an entire year, and so I read this many chapters of the Old Testament, this chapter of the New Testament, this psalm, this proverb. There's something to be said for that. Useful, right? But then there's also this kind of meditative reading where I am not doing academic study. I'm not just reading just to read for this kind of pleasure and enjoyment, but I'm kind of intentionally reading to think about the text in an important way. And so the first time reading through and then finishing, just a short passage, reading it through and then saying to myself, or in a group, right? We could do this as a group. What stands out to me as I read the Beatitudes, for example? What is it that stands out to me? Then I read through it again and say to myself, what do I notice about Christ? Or in the Old Testament, what do I notice about God out of this passage? And then reading it again and asking myself, okay, now that I've read through it, noticed what stood out to me, thought about Christ, what do I need to do now that I've read this passage? And so, reading it through in an intentional way, in a devotional way, to kind of pay attention to the text, allowing the text to speak instead of saying, I'm coming to this text in order to accomplish something else. Certainly there are other ways to approach reading devotionally, but that taking that time, taking the opportunity to meditate on the Word, then just analyze it and break down its parts, which is, of course, something we'll talk about. Probably we'll pick it up on Monday. Fasting is another spiritual discipline. Fasting is not something that is required. I believe it's not required. It's not condemned. It's encouraged in Scripture, but I don't believe we have to fast. But sometimes it's important to take the time to discipline yourself through fasting. Now, more than just, I haven't had time to eat today, but intentionally, not eating in order that I might have time for greater spiritual clarity. Now, I think also, though, what we're starting to see more of is that the suggestion, the encouragement to fast in other ways other than just food. Now, when Jesus talks about prayer and fasting, or just fasting in general, the focus is food. But there are other things, perhaps, that we need to take a fast from. Right? Electronics, media, right? Just taking the time to put that kind of stuff aside, right, and focus on spiritual things, whether that's reading, prayer. Right? And so we shouldn't lose that practice. It sometimes is very important and very helpful and allows us to focus on God because we've cut out other things for a brief time period. Worship, as we've already talked about, is a spiritual discipline. When you think about worship, we often approach worship as when I get there, something's going to happen. Right? So I go to worship on Sundays, or I go over to chapel, or I come to the Tuesday night devotional, or any of the other devotionals. But it's just like I'm doing the rest of my life, and I get here and I'm going to worship. But we don't prepare ourselves for worship. We don't reflect on worship after worship, right? And so we just kind of, right, I'm doing all this, now I'll do this, and then I'll do something else. And so we don't kind of discipline ourselves in the sense of, right, as I'm getting prepared to worship, I'm going to clear my mind, I'm going to, whatever else we might need to do. But disciplining ourselves to worship. Think also as well about your own personal worship. Again, rhetorical question. I'm not looking for an answer. How much do I personally worship outside of those collective times I gather together, either with a church on Sunday or a chapel or any variety of organized type things? Do I worship God on my own at any of those other times? Or is worship something that even though I say, right, it shouldn't be like that, have I made worship in my life only those things, or only those times when I'm getting together with somebody else to worship? Or do I make habits within my life to make time to worship God? Personally, individually, as well as collectively. Now, of course, if you are a minister that is involved in something like preaching or teaching, something like that, it's very easy to get in those worship settings and you lose worship because you're focusing on making sure you say the right things. You're trying to find the best way to say things. You're thinking about other types of things. Right? And so we have to, as ministers, discipline ourselves so that when we worship, we are worshiping and not just going through the motions. It's very easy, especially if you've grown up in a religious group, right? And you get your late teens, early 20s, and you sing a lot of the same songs, and you can sing and the mouth can be moving, and your brain is just somewhere else, right? Because you've sung it so many times. Right? It's being so often. It's just something that is very easy for us to kind of slip out of gear, right? And just kind of, my mouth is making the words, and so people are hearing me sing, but my brain, my heart is nowhere near it. And so we can go through the motions of worship, especially if we've grown up in a tradition and are used to a lot of the things that are done in worship, but be totally disconnected. So we need to discipline ourselves, even as ministers, when it comes to worship. Good.
Why is it that we, as churches and stuff, make this, go to the worship thing? Like, why do we have to have, I think, the routine aspect of it, and this, I think we kind of rush through it, like we have to get it done in an hour type of thing. So I think that kind of takes away from our focus and stuff. And I don't believe that's how the first century did it, the first century church, And so I've just always kind of wondered why we have to do it in a routine, why we have to have it done.
That's a good question, man. And I don't know that I have the answers as to exactly why we have to do it, but I would think it becomes a thing of it's a lot easier for us to slip into routines. I mean, think about what you do when you get up first thing in the morning. The things you go about, from the time you get out of bed to the time you're ready to leave your room, your house, wherever. We fall into a routine, all right? I shave first, and then I brush my teeth, and then I shower, and then, right? And when I shower, I wash my hair first, and I wash the rest of my body, right? And I have this routine. Can you do it out of order? Yeah. But you don't most of the time. Or if you do it out of order, you feel weird, right? Oh, I forgot to shave this morning, but I've taken my shower, and I got to shave, and this feels weird. Right? Now, that's quite different than our worship of the Lord of the universe. But it seems like we just easily fall into routines. And so it's kind of like we can develop in order to prevent that from happening, it takes intentionality. We have to intentionally work against the routine. But what happens is, if the routine becomes routine for so long, it's almost as if that's the way it's always been done, that's the way it should be done, and to try and suggest otherwise is to tend them out to say, I don't believe in God anymore, right, to some people. Even though, if you would ask them, right, do we have to sing 2 songs and then have a prayer? Well, no, we don't have to. But you do it differently, and people are like, well, I don't know if I like this. Why? What's the problem? Right? Having the Lord's Supper last, right? or preaching first, or any of these other kind of things where you could do it in a different order. There's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, certainly in some traditions, some religious traditions, it is very scripted, right? Down to you sing these songs at these times. But even in groups like the Churches of Christ, where we say, well, we don't do those kind of things. Sometimes that 2 songs in a prayer, a song scripture reading, a song communion, that can feel like the same kind of liturgical system like you might find something like Catholicism. Even down to the prayers that are said. Right? In some of those liturgical traditions, sometimes referred to as high church, they have down, these are the prayers that you said. Now, Churches of Christ, right, and I'm just kind of speaking from my experience, obviously in Churches of Christ, we don't technically have that. But if you listen to some prayers, there's a lot of ways they sound very similar. And words they use, right? God, guard, and direct us. What does that even mean? But you hear that in a lot of prayers. And so the danger is to fall into those routines. And so if you don't intentionally try to avoid that, it's going to happen just because we are people that like habits. And so I don't know if it's like biologically ingrained in us to make things habitual, and so we do that with worship as well, or if it's just a cultural press to make it routine. But you're right. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's something that it should be, but we fall into those traps. Other questions or comments? The last one, and certainly there are other spiritual disciplines we could talk about. Giving might be one we could talk about. Life examination. How often, again, rhetorical question, how often do you take stock of your life? Spiritually. I'm looking at myself, okay, where am I with respect to what I want to be, the person I want to be? Now, certainly there's the danger of Phariseeism, the danger of being too hard on ourselves, ignoring God's grace. But then we also should examine ourselves and say, are there practices, are there habits, are there things in my life, people in my life that are moving me away from God? And if so, how do I get rid of it? Looking at areas in my life, I need to be more disciplined about this. Those kind of things won't take place. That examination, that change won't take place unless we make the effort to examine our lives. Now, that's not necessarily an everyday thing. That's not we don't want to kind of foster a guilt within ourselves or constantly feeling guilty because, I haven't done this, I'm not more friendly today than I was yesterday. But every so often we ought to discipline ourselves to think about, where am I spiritually? Where is it I want to go? What do I need to do to get there? Right? Whether that's developing some things or getting rid of some things. So that might involve things like meditation, engaging in silence or detachment, right? Getting away from people, journaling, so I can chart my progress over time. And any of these things are ways to engage in that life examination. How do devotional studies and biblical studies work together? Because they seem like polar opposites. The academic side of investigating texts or developing congregational engagement models seems quite different to developing my spiritual life. Well, how do these two things work together? One, the practice of biblical studies helps enrich the life of the mind. And so while we might be doing well with praise, maybe even prayer, we need to recognize that God wants us to cultivate our minds for Him, right? The greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? And so we might have the heart stuff okay, we might need to develop the mind. And so biblical studies helps us develop that life of the mind. Not two, we shouldn't develop the mind to the detriment of the heart or the soul. But, devotional study isn't about developing, per se, the life of the mind. The analysis that's needed, the intellectual component, right? It's about the heart and the soul. So combining those two helps us in that way. Both of these together help us to connect to God. The danger, of course, is to get involved in biblical study. Now, I know plenty of people. I went to school with them. There is an organization known as the Society of Biblical Literature, SBL, that is filled with people who can do this, but are atheist or agnostic. And they can take apart a text, they can parse the Greek, they can do all sorts of things from the academic standpoint, but they have absolutely no faith in God. And so the biblical studies part is good, it's useful, but without the devotional component, we're not going to be connected to God. It just becomes something, this is my job, or this is what I do, this is my career. And it's not about this helping me, these practices helping me through biblical study to be closer to God. The discipline of both biblical studies and devotional practices are positive for us spiritually. Right? In order to engage in biblical studies, you have to be disciplined. Right? To follow procedures, to engage. All right, I need to look at these texts. I need to read these. I need to do this research, etc. It can help you develop those habits of discipline that can be used for devotional practice, and the devotional practices can help you develop habits of discipline to engage in the things you need to do, preparing for an exam, for example. And of course, like I said, you can engage in biblical studies without any sort of spiritual component. But the devotional practices will help you with your spiritual growth. And so it's not, you might be able to name all 12 of the apostles, all 12 of the minor prophets, all the kings of Israel and Judah. You might be able to pontificate on the Corinthian correspondence and discuss the different varieties of authorship of the book of Revelation. But it doesn't mean anything unless you're connected to God. It's not worth anything. And so you can fall into the academic style, right? And even, I'm kind of focusing on biblical text, but if you think about youth and family ministry, right? You read the most recent research about family strengths, and you have congregational models that could help you survey a congregation and determine what are the strengths and weaknesses. But if you don't have this, it's just a job. It's not worth anything. There are plenty of atheists that can do the exact type of case studies on a congregation and tell them, here are your strengths, here are your weaknesses, right? Give you goals and all sorts of things. But if you don't have that devotional life, it's not going to be worthwhile. All right, so where we're going next is to now get into some things about working with the text and focusing on research and some other things in preparing you for the research project, getting into more of the academic stuff. But because that is more involved than what we have in the 6-7 minutes we have left, we're going to go ahead and quit early today. And on Monday, we'll talk about exegesis and the process of getting the meaning